It is a few minutes past midnight on June 7th, 1944, somewhere along a narrow road cutting through the bocage country of Normandy. The hedgerows here are thick enough to swallow sound, and that is exactly the point. Two men lie flat in a drainage ditch, the damp soil pressing through their jackets, watching a length of road that, to anyone driving down it, looks utterly unremarkable. There is no checkpoint, no barricade, no sign that anything is wrong. But 6 inches beneath the gravel sits a black metal cylinder packed with explosive and running from it, buried in a thin slit in the earth, a length of cable snakes back to where the two men are waiting with a detonator the size of a small torch. Somewhere up the road, headlamps swing into view, dimmed to slits by regulation, but enough to make out the shape of a German lorry, then another, then the boxy silhouette of a half-track. The men do not move. They have done this before, or trained as if they had, and they know that the entire value of the weapon beneath that road depends on absolute stillness, absolute patience, and a willingness to let the enemy choose the moment of his own destruction. This is the story of how Britain's wartime scientists and a clandestine organization most people had never heard of turned a simple idea, a hidden charge and a hidden hand, into one of the most effective tools of irregular warfare in the Second World War, a weapon that needed no barrel, no muzzle flash, and no soldier standing in the open to use it. What makes this matter is not the size of the device or the elegance of its engineering, though both are worth examining. What matters is that this was a weapon designed not for armies, but for the absence of armies, for the moment when a handful of resistance fighters or commandos had to achieve, with almost nothing, what entire battalions were built to achieve with everything. It was a weapon for the weak to use against the strong, and that simple fact would change the character of warfare in occupied Europe. To understand why such a device became necessary, you have to understand the peculiar bind that Britain found itself in after the fall of France in June 1940. The British Army had been pushed off the continent at Dunkirk, stripped of much of its heavy equipment, and left to defend an island while German forces occupied territory from Norway to the Pyrenees. Conventional military doctrine, the kind taught at Sandhurst for a century, assumed that you fought wars with formed bodies of troops supported by artillery and armor, advancing along recognized fronts. That doctrine was now almost useless. There was no front. There was occupation, and beneath the surface of that occupation, a slowly growing, desperately under-equipped resistance made up of ordinary people with no military training, no heavy weapons, and no way of obtaining either through normal channels. Winston Churchill's instruction to the newly formed Special Operations Executive in July 1940 to set Europe ablaze sounded stirring in a cabinet room, but it created an immediate and very practical problem. How precisely was a network of French farmers, Polish railwaymen, Norwegian fishermen, and Belgian schoolteachers supposed to set anything ablaze when their only available weapons were sporting shotguns and kitchen knives, and when carrying anything heavier risked summary execution if discovered? The Germans, by 1941 and 1942, were moving an enormous volume of war material through occupied territory by road and rail, supplying garrisons, shifting troops between fronts, hauling fuel and ammunition to the coast. Allied bombing could strike fixed targets like railway yards and bridges, but it was blunt, often inaccurate, and could not be present everywhere a convoy might pass on a given night. What was needed was something that could be carried in a rucksack, hidden by a single person, left in wait for hours or days, and then detonated with surgical timing by someone who might be 100 meters away or several miles away by the time it went off. The standard anti-tank mines and demolition charges already in British service were not built for this. They were heavy, often weighing many kilograms, designed for engineers working in relative safety to lay belts of mines across a battlefield, not for a single agent who had cycled 20 miles after curfew with the device strapped beneath his coat. Pressure-activated mines were also indiscriminate. They could be triggered by a farm cart, a stray cow, or a German motorcyclist sent ahead to check the road, alerting the convoy behind and wasting the one opportunity an ambush team might get. Resistance circuits needed something selective, a weapon that let the operator see his target, judge the moment, and choose to act or not to act, rather than leaving that judgment to a length of pressure-sensitive metal under the road surface. They also needed something safe enough to be handled, hidden, and transported by people who were, by trade, bakers and clerks and students rather than trained sappers. Get the design wrong, and the first casualty of the weapon would be the very people it was meant to protect. This is where Britain's wartime backroom scientists entered the story, working out of an unassuming country house in Hertfordshire that the public would not learn about for decades. The Inter-Services Research Bureau, the cover name for the Special Operations Executives Research and Development Arm, ran its technical work largely from Aston House near Knebworth, with chemists, engineers, and a fair number of enthusiastic amateurs turning everyday materials into instruments of sabotage. The man most associated with the explosive devices to come out of this milieu was Cecil Clarke, an engineer who had previously built racing caravans, working alongside the chemist Stuff, like Major Jeffress at what became known as MD1, the Ministry of Defense's own irregular weapons workshop, sometimes nicknamed Churchill's Toy Shop for the eccentric and ingenious gadgets it produced. Their solution to the buried charge problem rested on two separate innovations working together: a plastic explosive that was safe, moldable, and powerful, and a command detonation system that put the moment of explosion entirely in human hands. The explosive itself, developed initially by chemists working with RDX, a compound considerably more powerful than the TNT used in conventional munitions, was blended with plasticizers until it had the texture and workability of stiff putty or modeling clay. An operative could knead it, shape it, pack it into a tin, a thermos flask, a hollowed-out log, or simply a buried tube, without the explosive becoming unstable or unpredictable in the way that older, more brittle explosives could be. A charge weighing perhaps 2 to 4 kilograms, roughly the weight of a couple of bags of sugar, could be molded to fit almost any container and concealed almost anywhere a few inches of soil, sand, or rubble could be disturbed and then made to look undisturbed again. The detonation side of the system was, if anything, the cleverer piece of engineering. Rather than relying on a pressure plate or a tripwire which could be set off by anyone or anything, the charge was wired to an electrical detonator connected by insulated cable, sometimes running many tens of meters, to a hand-operated firing device called an exploder, not much larger than a small wooden box with a plunger or a twist handle that generated enough current down the line to fire the detonator instantly. This meant the operator could lie concealed at a safe distance, watch the road through the hedge or from a ditch, and choose, in the last fraction of a second, exactly when to fire, picking a vehicle near the middle of a convoy rather than the front so as to block the road and trap as many vehicles as possible behind the wreck. The system also allowed for a delay fuse alternative, the so-called time pencil, a slender tube about the size of a cigarette containing a glass vial of acid that, when crushed, slowly ate through a wire holding back a spring-loaded striker, giving the saboteur anywhere from 10 minutes to several hours to be well away from the scene before the charge fired itself, useful for railway sabotage where no observer could safely remain nearby. Manufacturing these devices required a delicate balance between standardization, so that agents across many countries could be trained on a single, reliable system, and concealment, so that the components looked utterly unlike weapons if discovered in a search. Time pencils, detonators, and plastic explosive blocks were produced in workshops in England and shipped to forward stations, then parachuted into occupied Europe in containers disguised to look like ordinary supply drops, sometimes packed alongside boots, bicycle parts, or tinned food to disguise the true cargo from anyone intercepting a drop. Production numbers remain difficult to state with precision, since so much of the paperwork was deliberately thin or has simply not survived. But historians estimate that millions of feet of detonating cord, hundreds of thousands of time pencils, and very substantial tonnages of plastic explosive were shipped to resistance organizations across France, Norway, Yugoslavia, Poland, and elsewhere over the course of the war. In practice, this combination of moldable explosive and remote command detonation transformed what a handful of poorly armed civilians could achieve against a modern occupying army. French resistance circuits, often working with SOE-trained organizers parachuted in specifically to teach these techniques, used buried charges to derail troop trains, sever rail lines ahead of armored columns trying to reach Normandy in the weeks after D-Day, and ambush road convoys on routes that German planners had assumed were secure rear areas. The most heavily documented example remains the sustained campaign against the German 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, as it tried to move from the south of France towards the Normandy beachhead in June 1944. Resistance attacks using exactly this kind of buried, command-detonated charge contributed to delays that took the division nearly 3 weeks to cover a journey that should have taken 3 or 4 days, repeatedly cutting rail lines and roads and forcing convoys into ambushes along routes through towns such as Toul and the wider Limousin region. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans used similar British-supplied charges against German and Italian garrison transport on mountain roads where there was simply no other way to strike at a heavily armed motorized enemy. In Norway, charges of this type, supplied and partly trained by SOE, were used in sabotage operations against German military transport supporting the occupation, contributing to a climate in which no road or rail journey through occupied territory could be considered entirely safe. The psychological effect on German forces is harder to quantify than the material damage, but soldiers' letters and post-war German accounts repeatedly describe an atmosphere of suspicion that settled over rear areas. Once these attacks became common, drivers and officers alike aware that any stretch of apparently quiet road might conceal a watching pair of eyes and a buried charge. If you're finding the engineering and the history behind it as fascinating as I do, a quick subscribe really does help the channel more than you might think. It is worth pausing here to compare what Britain built with what its enemies and allies attempted in the same period. Germany possessed its own demolition charges and certainly understood remote detonation in principle, but German doctrine leaned heavily towards centrally organized combat engineering attached to regular formations, rather than equipping small clandestine cells with compact civilian portable sabotage kits. The Abwehr and later German security services spent enormous resources trying to penetrate and destroy resistance networks rather than replicate this particular model of dispersed, agent-carried sabotage, in part because Nazi doctrine simply did not trust irregular forces, German or foreign, with this kind of independent initiative. The Americans, once the Office of Strategic Services was established in 1942, essentially adopted the British approach wholesale, training with SOE instructors and using British pattern plastic explosive and time pencils in their own operations in France and elsewhere, a tacit acknowledgement that the British design had already solved the core problems of safety, concealment, and reliable timing. Where British equipment clearly outperformed early German improvised efforts was inconsistency. A badly made improvised charge using unstable industrial explosive might fail to detonate prematurely, or injure the person handling it, and accounts from less well-supplied resistance groups using locally sourced industrial explosives describe exactly these problems: misfires, premature blasts, and chemical burns from unstable mixtures. The standardized, factory-produced British system, by contrast, had a far more predictable safety margin precisely because the chemistry and the mechanics had been worked out by professional chemists and engineers rather than improvised in a barn. Assessing the overall impact of this weapon on the war honestly requires acknowledging real uncertainty. Historians broadly agree that the delays inflicted on German formations like Das Reich mattered to the Normandy campaign, buying time for Allied forces to consolidate the beachhead, but the precise tonnage of war material destroyed, the precise number of vehicles disabled, and the exact number of German personnel killed by this specific category of weapon across the whole European theater is simply not something the surviving records allow historians to state with confidence. What is much less ambiguous is the psychological and operational legacy. The model of small, highly mobile sabotage teams using concealed, remotely detonated plastic explosive charges against transport infrastructure became a template that influenced Special Forces doctrine for decades afterwards, echoes of which can be traced through Cold War unconventional warfare planning and into the design of demolition equipment still used by Special Forces and engineers today. Surviving examples of the explosives, detonators, time pencils, and exploder boxes used by SOE can today be seen in museum collections, including the Imperial War Museum in London and smaller specialist collections dedicated to the Special Operations Executive, alongside the diaries and recovered equipment of the agents who carried these devices into occupied Europe. Return for a moment to that ditch beside the Normandy road, to the two men lying still in the dark with a buried charge beneath the gravel and a detonator in hand. They are not soldiers in the conventional sense. They have no uniform that would protect them under the laws of war if captured, no army at their back, no certainty that what they do tonight will be recorded anywhere at all. What they have is a few kilograms of moldable explosive, a length of cable, and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to act. That is the whole of it, and it was enough. It was enough to derail trains that armies could not otherwise stop, enough to delay a panzer division by weeks rather than days, enough to turn quiet rear area roads into places where no German driver could ever feel entirely safe again. The genius of this weapon was never really in the chemistry, though the chemistry was sound, or in the mechanics, though the mechanics were elegant. The genius was in recognizing that the most powerful weapon available to the weak is the element the strong can never fully guard against: the choice of when, exactly when, to strike. Buried beneath an ordinary road, indistinguishable from the earth around it, this was a weapon built not to overpower an enemy, but to outweight him. And in the long, dark years of occupation, outweighting the enemy turned out to be one of the most powerful acts of war there was.